Hi, and good afternoon. I'm Jeff Goldenberg.
And I'm Naomi Kurtner. And just before we begin, a note on language. For simplicity's sake, we're going to use the word patient or the family or both.
And I'd like to thank all of you for being here with us today and for the work that you're doing regarding CRPs. Our 23-year-old daughter, Talia, died 6.5 years ago due to preventable medical error that occurred after elective surgery that was done to fuse some of the vertebra in her neck. And really, I should say errors in the plural, because Talia's death was due to a series of communication errors. If any one of 11 people had listened, believed, or acted in response to the concerns that we and Talia expressed repeatedly and with increasing urgency, Talia would still be alive today. Naomi and I were with Talia as she struggled to breathe for 20 hours, and we were mere inches from her when she spoke her last words, pleading for help because she couldn't breathe. Although when her airway closed, she was without oxygen for almost 20 minutes as an unprepared code team repeatedly failed to appropriately resuscitate her. We witnessed the whole thing. Last Thursday, I was listening to a segment on NPR on the current state of coronavirus in the US, and one of the people being interviewed was Dr. Howard Koh of Harvard School of Public Health. And they were discussing the current death toll, and he said, and I quote, "As a physician, I learned from caring for patients for years that when a loved one dies, that's a tragedy. But when your loved one dies and you know that death could have been prevented, that's a tragedy that haunts you forever." And I will say he is right. We are haunted every day. And 6.5 years later, no member of the hospital has ever initiated any contact with us to review what happened nor to apologize. And today to talk with you about ongoing communication with patients and families after an unanticipated outcome that results in harm. Nicole, you could put the first slide up, I think. In the ongoing communication with patients and families after harm, it's important to remember that the patient and family need to be kept primary. This slide is meant to represent where everybody's priorities should lie when dealing with patients and families after an incident of harm. It's called ring theory, and it's meant to clarify each person's position after a crisis. Basically, it's comfort in, dump out. And by that, what I mean is the people at the center get the attention or comfort they need from people who are in more outer rings. Those people and empathizing with those closer in. And if somebody in one of the outer rings needs support, they in turn should be turning to somebody in a ring even further out than their own. It sounds sort of obvious when I explain it and look at this, but in reality, it just doesn't always happen like that. While Talia was in a coma, laying brain dead in the ICU, a doctor who'd been part of the code team that failed Talia was passing by, and seeing us, he stopped to talk. He told us how awful it had been to be in the room during the failed code, so much so that he needed 2 beers along with some Benadryl to get to sleep for the past 2 nights. Initially, it had seemed like he was going to commiserate with us, but he did not relate his experience to ours, nor did he inquire about or recognize us. After telling us about his lack of sleep, he could have said something like, "I can't imagine what gosh, are you guys even able to sleep?" But he didn't. He didn't ask us about our situation or Talia. Sharing his experiences the way he did put us in the position of having to look out for him when it should have been the other way. He was on an outer ring. We were in the center. Nicole, you can go ahead and take that slide down now. In our experience, a common mistake we see CRP leaders make is in their effort to get the patient to understand how difficult this is for the provider too. But think about that ring theory slide. That's asking those in the center to turn outward towards someone in an outer, larger ring.
And it really is not the responsibility of the harmed patients and families to be concerned with how the providers are doing. That job lies work and with you, the folks who are conducting the CRP. Over time and with a well-executed CRP, the patient and family might begin to incorporate the experiences of the providers, but pushing families and patients to see this too quickly, too early, will just build resentment. But sometimes things do shift over time. Take the example of Talia's nurse in the ICU. In the hours leading up to Talia's airway occlusion, Talia couldn't breathe at all if she was on her back, and she was deteriorating, struggling mightily. And she hadn't yet been able to get out of bed. Yet the nurse reported that Talia was being transferred out of the ICU to the regular ward, and that her doctors didn't feel she needed any further treatment and had no further orders for her. Completely taken aback and terribly worried, I asked how that could possibly be when Talia was so clear. The nurse just shrugged and said, literally, that she was going with the doctors. This was a moment of total abandonment when Talia's advocate stopped advocating. 3 years after Talia's death, the Seattle Times published Mike Baker's article on Talia and the hospital, and we learned for the first time about the grim realities occurring within the walls of that place. We hadn't known any of that. I began to imagine the stresses and strains on this nurse who was working in a truly toxic environment with abusive and power-hungry bosses. And not only was she a nurse and therefore had less power, but a woman and an immigrant too. Talia's nurse remains responsible for her actions and their consequences. She has Talia's death on her hands. But I also understand better now the context in which that took place, and I'm in a better position feelings and realities simultaneously. Timing is everything, though. If you had asked me to be understanding about that nurse's context at any point in, say, the first year after Talia died, I would have been just livid. I probably would have walked right out, because context or not, the only thing that mattered to me was that Talia died a brutal, tortuous, frightening death that was completely preventable, and this nurse bears responsibility for that. In the beginning and a long while after, nothing about how things felt for that nurse was my concern.
Loss, betrayal, and recovery move through stages, and you can't make someone move to a new stage just because you've put it in your agenda. The grief, the anger, the disruptions to their lives, it's going to be different for each family and for member. Nicole, you can put up the next slide. As I alluded to earlier, when an adverse outcome occurs, regardless of whether it's associated with medical error or not, for the patient and family, it's an enormous breach of their trust, and rebuilding trust with the patient and family is going to be critical to a successful CRP. We call this slide the circle of trust. Remember that while as an individual, you know yourself to be trustworthy, as a representative of the institution where the patient and family have experienced harm, they will view you as not trustworthy. Your job as a communicator with the family is to prove to the patient and family that in spite of what happened, the institution and the people in it hold themselves accountable and know that they failed the patient and family. As you work to regain their trust, that means every time you say you're going to do something, you follow through. If you fail to be accountable, you're confirming for them what they've come to believe, that you're not reliable or trustworthy, just like they thought.
A few years ago, I learned about Josie King's death, the little girl who died at Johns Hopkins, and famous as an example of a hospital that owned up to its error rather than doing the more typical deny and defend. It's telling that the detail that has stuck with me the most is this, that the person in charge of communicating with the family called Josie's mom every single Friday morning, week in and week out, whether he had something new to report about the investigation or not.
And remember also that there are missteps bound to happen along the way. That's okay. Is another way to demonstrate that you're open and responsible. It's part of that circle of trust and rebuilding trust. So we want to shift now from accountability to the role of empathy in reestablishing trust. The word empathy gets bandied about a lot, but it's important to talk about what empathy actually means, what it looks like when it's employed and what it doesn't. And Nicole, you can take the slide down now. Empathy is not about being touchy-feely. It simply means being present for another, seeing the world as they see it. It's about creating an atmosphere that allows another person to express themselves honestly. As you reflect a person's statements back to them, you're a mirror for them. As that person feels understood, they begin to understand themselves. Empathy is not about helping, sorry, empathy is about helping another person make meaning of their experience.
Formulaic statements are not empathy. Being genuine while interacting with people is. Learning examples of empathic statements is really important, but insufficient, because the words don't empathize, you do. How you say it, how you interact matters most. Empathy is not just essential to a successful CRP, it's crucial to the practice of all safe medicine. And I'm a stickler about it because it's the single missing link that ties together all the non-care Talia received from her providers, including doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, respiratory, and speech therapists. Empathy, a teachable skill, by the way, boils down to being an active listener, something we each have the capacity to do. None of Talia's 11 providers demonstrated didn't listen to her or to us, and now Talia is dead. There are many ways to demonstrate empathy and active listening, and I do want to reinforce that being perfect is not necessary in order to achieve a successful CRP. Last October, when I watched a close friend talk a stranger off a bridge over a freeway, I witnessed something profound, sacred even. If you were teaching a course in crisis intervention, though, my friend Claire would have failed on many of the particular statements she made. But she was so present for this man, with her entire being focused on him, along with her caring and attitude and genuine concern. Her word choice really didn't matter. As for our own experience, as Jeff noted earlier, nobody from the hospital ever initiated contact with us after Talia died. Several years after her death, I contacted the hospital to see if we couldn't establish some kind of relationship. After all, it's a pretty big thing to share the death of a person between us. I didn't yet know about CRPs, but understood the concept of restorative justice and hoped we could establish some kind of working relationship. In other words, I pretty much tried to lead my own CRP. But I'm sad to say that because the hospital wasn't fully on board with my or any CRP, my attempt failed. The CEO and CMO we met with gave the appearance of empathizing, but weren't actually empathizing. It felt to us in the aftermath like they'd made a plan beforehand to just agree with everything I said, but nodding over and over isn't empathizing. Worry less about your exact words, but do get yourself in a space where you're ready and able to make both the patient and family, both your concern and your priority. This is going to be easier for you as a person not directly involved in the incident of harm than it will be for the providers who were. Their job will necessarily be messier since their own feelings about the incident will come into play. But you're one step removed, and that can be really helpful in reestablishing a good relationship.
Another thing to remember is being vulnerable. part of being real with the patient and family, and it's a way of showing you care. If you're moved and you're feeling sad or angry on the patient's behalf, or you even end up teary in a shared moment of grief, that is meaningful. It shows that you, in your role as a representative of the hospital, get it. One last crucial thing that we need to talk about is anger. We really want to emphasize that because anger plays a big role in the lives of harm patients and families. And it's an important topic because in our culture, we're pretty uncomfortable with that emotion, yet it is the primary response to betrayal. And unfortunately, when we're taught about anger, we learn to think of it as a bad emotion, and we're certainly not really taught how to deal with it. Often, the way it's dealt with is through distraction or suggesting that somebody focus on the positive instead of just sitting with their anger, or just ignore it altogether, hoping it'll go away. In the case of medical harm, it's not going to go away. Anger is not only a natural human feeling, but after betrayal, it's a really appropriate response. It's entirely reasonable and sensible to be enraged when somebody's violated your trust.
Remember, though, that the patients and families got the same memo you did that anger isn't okay. And yet here they are, perhaps feeling more anger and rage than they've ever experienced in their lifetime. That can be pretty scary and overwhelming. In your role, you can help normalize their experience by letting them know that it's an expected and natural, if uncomfortable, response to the situation. And when you acknowledge someone's anger directly, its explosiveness and volatility will usually lessen. If this feels counterintuitive or uncomfortable to you, which is certainly common, additional training might be beneficial. But however you get there, it's just critical that you don't ignore the angry elephant in the room, or it will never leave and can most definitely undermine the entire CRP. Please also don't impose the expectation that the patient and family will forgive those who harmed them or that their anger will ever go away, because it very well might not. Before we close, I want to finish our story about my self-run CRP with the hospital. We closed our meeting with the CEO and CMO with a verbal commitment to work together. In fact, the CMO suggested we meet again within a couple of weeks. However, over the ensuing weeks, which turned into months, the responses to my follow-up emails were either non-existent or non-substantive. After 3 months of this, I pointedly but respectfully asked the CEO in an email to give me an honest answer about whether they wanted to continue working with us. The CEO's response was to reprimand me for my tone, me that if we were going to work together, my attitude would have to change. Talk about a textbook definition of chutzpah. He felt justified in being more upset by the tone of my email than I was entitled to feel after watching my daughter die in his hospital due to negligence. After years of no accountability, I offered the hospital a chance to become accountable, to which they responded by showing a lack of empathy, followed by a further lack of accountability, and then topped it off by not holding our experiences as the family who was harmed as their central concern. In the end, this is a perfect example of what not to do. Ultimately, and unfortunately, the CEO's attitude and actions just reinforced, amplified, and solidified all my bitterness and anger about the hospital and the people in it. Clearly, where they were not ready to go. But they, like any hospital or institution that has harmed a patient or family, bear a moral and ethical obligation to us, which they have not yet fulfilled. That's why we appreciate so deeply the fact that you all here are figuring out how best to carry out this important work. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Naomi, for sharing your story and with your openness and your vulnerability and the practical advice that the community can really benefit from. Before we move into questions, we're going to transition over to Brandolyn so she can share some of her experiences as well. So with that, Brandolyn, I will pass it off to you and put your slides up.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks so much. All right, Nicole, I'm going to let you run these. So I will just, before we advance, I think I know most of the people on the call, which is a good advantage. So I won't spend too long talking about my experience, but I do want to share a little bit for anybody that I don't know. If you'd go ahead and advance the slide. As you saw before, my name is Brandolyn Bergstadt. I have been in a somewhat unique position, having experienced medical error and also become an administrator in healthcare myself. I never expected to be involved in healthcare. I thought I was on my way to becoming an attorney. And then I went into labor at 23 weeks with my daughter, Claren, who you see pictured here. That is a thumb on her head, if that helps you get a sense of size, for those of you who are not familiar with micropreemies. I experienced two different hospitals in our experience with Claren. The first was when I went into labor, again at 23 weeks. I had woken up in a pool of blood. I was rushed to the hospital. I really had no idea what to expect. I was so naive about healthcare at that point that I didn't even understand that there was a difference between an obstetrician and neonatologist. So when I was asking for help, I didn't even really understand the people to ask for. So I was at a bit of a disadvantage then. 30 years old, just again, having never even been really admitted to a hospital. We spent 12 hours in that hospital trying to advocate for Claren. And unfortunately, during our admission, a nurse had conducted a physical exam and she had made the assumption that my daughter had died inside me based on what she felt. Didn't conduct the necessary tests to confirm that. And unfortunately, what I now know is called anchoring bias ensued. Everybody relied on what she had determined and tried to convince me for the next 12 hours that my daughter had in fact died. I knew that wasn't true because she was kicking inside of me. So you can imagine the horror that we experienced during that time. About 12 hours after I was admitted, we were in fact examined by a physician and then finally got an ultrasound. They decided my daughter was viable and then transferred us, thank goodness, to the medical center where my daughter was born about a week later. And we spent 4 months in neonatal intensive care. And having the ability to see those two situations back to back was instrumental in really changing my life and my family's life. Understanding how people who could care so much could get things so wrong was very, very important to me to understand. And as you can imagine, if you are hospitalized for 4 months with a micropreemie, there's not a lot you can do during that time. And so I spent a lot of time watching the staff, a lot of time getting to know them personally, seeing their reactions to all of the different things that are happening. Of course, we were in a group room, so they couldn't hide a lot from me at that time either. And so I think had a really unique point of view into getting to see their side of things while also experiencing my own. And that inspired me to get involved myself. I really felt passionately about making sure that not only did nobody experience what I experienced, but that I helped the healthcare team that I saw really, spending nights at the hospital, not sleeping, pouring everything they had into the care of my daughter and into other children, supporting them as well. And I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like, but now I do. So now I work for Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. I've been there for about 9 years. I was previously with Evergreen Healthcare. And we do a variety of things in our Office of Patient Experience. But I have these two pictures up to kind of juxtapose. This is where I started, with this very fragile, very vulnerable child and really doing everything I could to advocate on her behalf. And now you can see there, I have actually a team of 7, 4 of them do patient relations work almost exclusively. And so it's very interesting being on this side now and having to talk with families who are concerned about the care that they're receiving. So that's where I'm coming from, this lens. And I found it so interesting. I had a chance to chat just a little bit with Jeff and Naomi before we put together our conversations, but we didn't actually compare too many notes on what was being said. And as I was listening to them, I'm just reflecting on I think I feel a little validated in some of what I'm going to say, and I hope it's helpful because you're going to hear a lot of the same things mirrored, if slightly differently. I'm really going to be coming from the point of view of the healthcare personnel having a conversation with a family, and you'll see some of the things that they talked about reflected here. So, Nicole, I'll go ahead and have you advance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about disclosure conversations and some of the things that I've noticed that people don't do, and what we should do instead. And I just want to open, and I know it's so hard not to read that slide, but I'm going to ask you not to for just a moment. I want to make sure that you understand I am not sharing these from the perspective of teaching you how to care. You already care. What I know about healthcare staff and administrators and CEOs is that you are losing sleep, that you are trying very hard to do right by families. I know that you keep names and pictures of families who have experienced medical error up on your bulletin boards. And sometimes because you can't have a conversation yet without crying about that family, you keep them in your desk. I know this to be true because I've seen them and I've talked with all of you who've had that experience. So when I share things, it's not because you don't care, it's because you care deeply. And because we care and because we don't know the right thing to do, sometimes that gets in our way. And so I'm going to just bring to your attention some of the things that I've noticed that get in our way during these conversations. So the first thing is, you set the stage. This is just super important. When we walk into conversations with families all too often, as a way of, I think, trying to be more patient and family centered, and I put that in quotes because I think that covers a lot of ills in the industry, unfortunately. But in an effort to be more centered, we sometimes will walk into a room and we expect the family to start that conversation, or we think we're being kind by allowing them to start that conversation. And we kind of go into that room and smile and say, "Thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you lead." No, they don't need to lead. We need to lead. This is our responsibility, not theirs. And in fact, when we ask somebody else to lead a conversation, we put responsibility onto them. And that's not their job. We heard Jeff and Naomi talk a little bit about that during their talk. The responsibility lies with us. And so it's super important that we walk in and we hold that space for that family, because for all the reasons that Jeff and Naomi were talking about, they deserve to have whatever emotional reactions they're going to have in that meeting. And it's us to hold space around that. That's our responsibility. So I put a sample script up here. I'm going to read it through for you. This is going to be something that you'd put in your own words. This is something that might not sound exactly like this. And of course, the situation might be different. The script that I put together sounds like this. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for coming to talk with us. The intent of this meeting is for us to share all the details we know regarding your mother's experience in our care. I want to be sure that what we know, you know. And that's important. So I'm going to stop right there. I put that in teal specifically to help you understand it's important to be real with people in the same ways that Jeff and Naomi were talking. You can't be reading a script. While I think it's important to sometimes write down and get notes for what you want to say so you get them right in your own head, we really need to speak in plain language and help people understand what exactly we're talking about. And this particular concept is something that patients and families relate to. I want to make sure that what we know, you know. And what that says is we're going to be transparent with you. Any detail we have, we're going to share it. I went on to say, I know you have some specific questions regarding why the nurse didn't stop the medication right away and why your mother was examined by Dr. Fisher instead of Dr. Silvera. We're going to answer those questions, as well as some others you might not have known to ask. If it's okay with you, I'd like to take about 30 minutes to share what we found, to talk that through with you, and then leave the remaining half of the meeting for you to ask any additional questions or get clarity on anything we have shared. Does that sound okay? The reason we want to do that is we don't want patients and families to be thinking about what they need to do. They don't need to be thinking about, do I need to bring up these questions? Are they sure? Do they know everything that I wonder about? Lead with that information. Let them know we've got them. We've got them for the duration of this conversation, and here's what's going to happen. Here's what we bring to the table so that they can relax and actually hear you. Because if they're thinking about, do I have to fight for information? Am I going to have to fight for my loved one? They're not hearing you, and it's very, very, very critical that they do. All right, you can move on. All right, remaining present. So we spend so much time thinking about patients and families' emotions, what they're going to be saying, how they're going to be feeling, and really we need to be spending much, much more worried about our own. And I say that so that we can remain present in the conversation. So before you go into a conversation, any conversation about medical error, any conversation about families' dissatisfaction with their care, you need to be aware of yourself. You need to really, really know yourself very, very well. You need to understand how you react during stress, What happens to your body? What happens to you emotionally? What happens to you physically? What happens to you behaviorally when you're worried, when you're stressed, so that you can make sure that you recognize those in a conversation and manage them so they don't come out in your behavior towards the family. You need to come up with strategies to keep yourself engaged in that conversation so you don't check out in an effort to save yourself. And that's just human, right? We all do that. We all do a little bit of dissociation when we can't take the input that's coming at us. And in these conversations, it's vitally important that we remain present. Understanding your fears in general for disclosure of error, but mostly I'm thinking about your fears for this particular situation. So I know, having been on the other side of it now, that there are sometimes we go into a conversation with a family and we think, oh my gosh, I hope they don't ask this. Sometimes we say that to ourselves because we might not know the answer, and we might know that we can't get that answer, and we might never. So we're hoping, oh gosh, please don't ask that, because we want to do right by families, but we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared for our worst fear to come true in that conversation. And that's going to depend on who you are and what your position is. But if we can understand what our fears are going in and be prepared how to respond to them if they come true, it's going to help us remain present, be calm in that conversation, and show up for families in the way that they deserve us to. All right, next slide. All right, it isn't enough to care. What I mean by that is it's not enough to care in your heart. You actually have to demonstrate caring. Caring has to be a verb for this to work. Jeff and Naomi talked about, it's not okay just to nod your head and say yes and agree to everything. Why? Because it's not true. It's not authentic. It's not actually being in a conversation with somebody. So what I wrote here was caring is only valuable when it's demonstrated. Pay attention to this is what I call conversational events, and respond the way that you would respond if you weren't afraid of doing the wrong thing. Naomi talked about her friend that talked somebody off of the bridge. Her friend was not worried about doing the wrong thing. She wasn't worried about the words that she said or if somebody was going to sue her based on something. She was worried about keeping that man from jumping. And that's how you need to be responding to families. And I do understand that there are all kinds of concerns on the risk end for hospitals. I share this in an effort to actually keep us out of harm's way when it comes to risk. That we know, and this is of course why Tom does this work at all, that families who feel heard, families who feel validated, families with whom we've shared transparently are far less likely to create a problem for us as a hospital than if they think we're hiding something. So it's super important to be transparent. So I'm going to go through what I call conversational events. So let's say a family starts crying. A pretty typical response from staff is for everything to kind of stop, people to look a little uncomfortable. Somebody's going to offer a tissue. They'll usually have to go to another room to get it. But they'll say something like, "It's okay, we understand." And then everybody stares at the person who's crying, and silence ensues until that crying is over. And that is not an empathetic response. So an empathetic response is to think about how would you respond if you were at a coffee with a friend and they just started crying. You wouldn't sit there. You wouldn't stare at them and wait for them to finish. You would say, "Oh my gosh." And you would probably even get up from your chair. You might come over and sit closer to them. You might put your hand on their shoulder and say, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." So in this situation, when you're talking with a family, respond. And responding is not waiting. Responding is doing something that matches what's happening with them. So you're going to lean in. You're going to get closer to that person. You're going to make eye contact with them. If it's appropriate, you're going to use touch to say, "We're here. Take your time. It's okay." If that crying goes on for a long time, I've seen any number of things be useful in that conversation. One of the things is to honestly talk about the loved one. One of the conversations I had with a parent was about their child, and I was able to bring up something that I read in the notes from the nurses. One of the things that, and I'm going to make up a name, but that I read about Jim is that he used to like to do this, and the nurses actually kept that in his medical record. I don't know if you know that. I don't know if you know that they were taking notes and that they understood that he loved baseball. Those sorts of things. Have a conversation with people to say, "I know who your loved one is. I care about them. And I'm willing to sit and talk with you as long as it takes." All right, conversational event number 2, family raises their voice. This is probably the thing that people worry about most. People who, they feel angry, often rightfully so, and that they are raising their voice in an effort to get us to understand. And that's the one thing I really want you to, if there was one thing you could take away from this, it would be this for me. If somebody is continually raising their voice with you, it's because you do not yet understand. There is something that is vitally important to them, and they are escalating because you haven't yet understood. And so when I think about being in a conversation, there's two parts to being in a conversation. One is what's being said, and one is actually the process of how that's happening. And in these conversations, it's super important to be able to step outside of those conversations and just be an observer as well. So, when somebody's raising their voice, it's an important thing for you to be able to click on that I haven't understood something, and to own that. So in this case, and this actually mirrors what Naomi was saying about, somebody saying, what was it? If that attitude continues, we can't work together, whatever that was. Somebody, a normal response would be, I'm sorry, I can't continue when you're speaking at this level. But an empathetic response would be, wow, and take a moment. I really messed up just now. I'm so sorry. What I actually want is to figure out how we can help. Like, can we try again? But to actually stop that conversation. I'm a trainer for Crucial Conversations. If you have not read that book by Vital Smarts, you need to. It's an incredible resource in terms of how to just conduct difficult conversations. And what they call that is stepping out of the conversation. It's learning to look at what's happening, stepping out of it, and repairing the safety that has been compromised in that conversation. If somebody's escalating with you, safety has been compromised, and you got to repair that trust in that conversation before you can continue on, or they're not going to hear you, and you are most likely not going to hear them either. All right, conversational event number 3, family blames you. And when I say you, I don't mean the hospital, I mean you personally. They blame you, whatever your role is, whether you're the risk administrator, whether you are the doctor, whether you are a scheduler, it really doesn't matter, but they feel like you had a hand in making this happen. And I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound scary, but if it happened, you probably did. And what I mean by that is we're all a part of the healthcare system. It doesn't mean that we knowingly did wrong, but it means that everybody's role plays a part. And so demonstrating discomfort, sort of a typical response if somebody blames you, especially if they use profanity or name calling, we would say, I think we'd be more productive if we avoid name calling. It's, again, that kind of a shaming start to a conversation when what we really need to do is be real and say something like, if this happened to my mother, I'd feel that way too. I'm sorry for the part I played in allowing this to happen. What we're saying there is not that we are responsible for everything, but that we do play a role. Anybody working in a hospital, when there's an error, plays a role in it. And it's for us to figure out what is that role and how can we do better. And if we communicate that to families, they're going to feel heard, they're going to feel validated. And what I've witnessed on countless conversations on the phone and in person with families is that there is a point at which they reach in a conversation. And when they feel validated, you see a switch happen. They stop and pretty instantly move into grief, and they start being able to move through that grief. And that's where our responsibility to them really starts, is to help them move through that grief. But unless we're willing to take responsibility, unless we can really be present with them, they'll never get to that point. And so it's really on us to, again, hold space for them, make sure that whatever emotions they're experiencing in the moment are okay, and that we are responding to them, not just passively allowing them to happen and sort of grandly saying they're fine, but to respond in that moment, to get up out of our chair, to walk over to them and say, I'm so sorry that you're having to navigate this right now. This is not how we would want any of our patients to feel. All right, I'm going to stop there. This is, you've got my contact information there for questions. But I wanted to give some practical advice because I think, what's true is that every one of you on this call care, whether you're a patient advocate or whether you're a healthcare professional, you care deeply or you wouldn't make time to be here today. And again, when we care deeply, sometimes we get in our own way. It's important to step out of that and understand, how can I react? How can I demonstrate what I really want in a conversation and be successful in doing that? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brandolyn, for sharing your personal experience and that practical advice with the community. We'd love to do 2 things with the remainder of the time we have. Tom is going to help synthesize some of the key skills that we learned today, but we also want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions from any of you. We'd love to have conversations, so you can either type them in the chat if you have questions, or feel free to unmute yourself and speak. So thank you.
And Nicole, why don't this would be a great time to hear questions. Naomi and Jeff and Brandolin gave truly amazing presentations, and they're here as a resource for all of us in healthcare to understand how can we be more patient and family centered when something has gone wrong. So I just want to make sure folks have a chance to ask your questions before we do a little bit of wrap up. Nicole or Pauline, have any questions come in via the chat?
No questions yet.
I'd sure like to say a few words.
Oh, that'd be great, Rex. Thank you.
I would like to thank Jeff and Naomi and Brandolin for their information here and presentation. Having my own first-hand experience with medical error, I understand exactly where you're coming from. And although I most certainly think that CRP has its place, it doesn't resolve the first problem, which is why in the world do these errors have to happen in the first place? There's no reason for these errors. And we need to find a way to solve that. I mean, if we can beat the errors in the first place, then CRP becomes mute. But I understand it has its place as well. But I would like to most certainly point out that what I see is that the medical professionals did not listen to the patients, did not listen to the family. And that's where they keep making the mistakes over and over again. Patients and families need to be listened to. Thank you.
Naomi and Jeff or Brandolin, would either of you like to respond?
No, I think, this is Brandolin, I think that nobody could disagree with Rex there in terms of, really what we're looking for is for errors to never happen. I think that there are, unfortunately, what I know from being on this side is that the reasons for medical errors sometimes are incredibly complex, not always. Sometimes it does come right down to, in fact, I'm thinking of something in my mind right now, but right down to what Rex is saying, that it is just not listening. But there also are many errors that come down to complexity and human error. And what I have found, Rex, and I know this doesn't erase medical error, but what I have realized is that conversations like this one, CRP, having these conversations, having professionals like me, like the others that are on the call, present and sharing this. And this is why this is what I would say to everybody on this call as a point of action is don't let this be something you did today. Let this be something that you take and you share with 5 others today. It's not enough to just keep it as a point of learning for yourself. But Rex, what I see is that CRP is actually elevating the conversations throughout the hospitals so that people are listening more. They are checking their own bias more. And the more that we can do this, the better. And of course, working closely with our patient safety colleagues to ensure that we are putting safeguards into place on the other side is of course vitally important. But I see this elevating the conversations, and I do see people responding differently on the healthcare side. Thanks, Tom.
Oh, Naomi, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that obviously I agree with you. Our daughter's dead because nobody listened. But in terms of the CRPs, I think that they also are a model that should be used, a communication model that doesn't need to be used just after harm occurs. I think if we're using the CRP model of communication, that's what will get people to be authentically listening and transparent about what's happening so that less harm will happen afterwards. And I think that's one of the reasons we're involved in the work, is that they have the potential to make a hospital more transparent on the back end, which means that the hospital is learning to communicate that way, or the members, the teams, and that therefore if those same communication skills are employed, then less harm will happen to begin with. But I also just think converting the whole methodology, if a nurse doesn't get to a patient in time and they soil their bed, there's a moment for a small CRP right there where you own what you did, you're humbled, you acknowledge that you did wrong and you do it better the next time. And in that moment of connection, there's a relationship that deepens and harm is less likely to happen of the magnitude that we're all talking about. So for what it's worth, I think there's a role for the CRPs in changing what happens on the front end, not just on the back end.
That's great, Naomi. And Rex, I would just add, that learning is an important part of the CRP model, but I think you're right to point out that that's an area where we've got a long ways to go to demonstrate that that learning is actually happening. And one of the things that's infuriating appropriately to patients and families and the public is when the same error happens over and over and over again and we can't seem to learn. So learning is a part of the CRP model, but it's something where we need to do a much better job of turning that principle into practice. Were there other questions that folks have for Naomi and Jeff or Brandolin? I asked a friend and colleague, Dan O'Connell, to join us today. Many of you have interacted with Dan, but for those of you who haven't, Dan is an amazing resource. He's a clinical psychologist who's been working nationally for many years in the area of communication in healthcare generally, but also has done a ton of training locally and nationally around responding to harm events. And we've been enjoying talking with Dan more recently about the challenges of handling emotion. Dan, I don't know when you were able to join and whether you heard some of Brandolin Bergstadt's comments. Brandolin is a patient advocate who works at the Cancer Care Alliance, but Brandolin was talking about the importance of healthcare workers managing their own emotions if they're going to be truly present for the patient and family. Do you have a few quick words of wisdom for the group if they're wanting to improve the ability of their healthcare workers to manage their own emotions in these super stressful encounters?
Tom, let me know if you can hear me because I've been having a world of technical difficulties today.
No, we can hear you great.
Good. I did hear Brandolin, but unfortunately I missed the first many minutes. What has struck me is I mean, Brandolin's comments I thought were perfect. In the enactment of that conversation, those are the emotional intelligence skills. Frankly, those are the ethical, moral skills as well. I mean, are we committed to telling the truth? Are we committed to telling the whole truth? We've usually done an investigation of some length particularly before a CRP conversation, right? These are not ad hoc at the bedside conversations. And so I think the challenge emotionally for clinicians and all starts even well before the conversation. It starts with, are we ready to actually face the consequences of our behavior, right? How do we deal with our own fears as we recognize that perhaps some of our actions or inactions may have caused harm to a patient or family member? So I appreciate the piece I heard and see even more important in the sense of clinicians being encouraged, organizations creating the kind of structure and safety where frightened clinicians can from the very beginning be willing to self-reflect on their participation in care, that they can answer the question, oh my goodness, did some aspect of the care I provided harm a patient? And I think that happens so far upstream of the actual conversation with patients and families that I think now the challenge is, of course, is to help all clinicians and risk managers and attorneys and executives recognize that their fears and anxieties begin almost as soon as there's a recognition of patient harm. And what they do with those fears and anxieties is going to lead them either to be self-protective, perhaps even deceptive, stonewalling, self-absorbed, right? Or it's going to lead them to kind of manage their emotions, get in touch with the empathy that Brandolin was talking about, and say ethically and psychologically, of course, we have to proceed down the road of transparency and healing. So, my interest, Tom, as we've talked about, is not just the conversation, which I thought Brandolin characterized so beautifully, It's what are we going to do about all of the emotions that clinicians, executives, risk managers, and defense counsel have that lead them to consider being self-protective, self-absorbed, rationalizing, being less than candid, rationalizing, avoiding the patient, or simply rationalize, forcing the patient and family to take the initiative to find out things about their care that we knew from the very beginning.
That's great, and I really look forward to all of you hearing much more from Dan and Naomi and Jeff and Brandolin down the road. I did want to throw out a question, and Naomi or Jeff or Brandolin, you're welcome to react to it, or someone in the audience can react. One of the things that strikes me is, you know, for so many years when there was a problem in healthcare, we were in this deny and defend mode, which is inherently adversarial. Sort of right from the beginning, we're going to be fighting with each other. And the CRP model is really calling for collaboration and partnership. But what strikes me is that the reality is, I think oftentimes we're in some world where we have both happening at the same time. We're trying to collaborate with the patient and family. We're wondering, is this an adversarial process? If so, how should I behave differently? Brandolin or Naomi or Jeff, do you have any thoughts about sort of how we balance the adversarial elements of this with trying to be more collaborative?
Well, Tom, one thing that I'll say, obviously there isn't one answer that covers all situations, but I think one thing is that if you feel that somebody is being less than open and that they're being defensive and they're posturing and trying to justify what happened rather than being upfront with you about what happened, I think that immediately starts, for me as a patient and victim, makes me start feeling suspicious about what's going on the other side. And I think that we're conditioned by our society in general to think, well, if somebody did something, then you sue them. And I think that there may be some real financial consequences of some of the errors that happen, and that if in addition to feeling like people are being open with you, you have some realization that the hospital or institution is going to step up and help cover the financial costs of the error in addition to telling you about it, that takes a lot of wind out of my sails anyways, because there's not much to be fighting about then.
That's great. Naomi or Brandolin, anything either of you would like to add?
I would just echo actually what Jeff just said. You know, one of the things that was interesting about my experience personally is, you know, while we experienced a pretty grievous, you know, just egregious medical error, you know, when I was in labor with her, and then when we were subsequently hospitalized for 4 months, we did experience medical error once there. It was not as serious. It was. And yet, you know, because of the first experience that we had, I did wonder about how is this going to go. And I had all the emotion churned up, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to go in fighting for information. And it didn't actually happen that way. The way that this sort of what he said took the wind out of my sails. I went to rounds in the morning, and the very first thing the attending said was, I understand we had an event last night. This is what I understand you're aware of. We have a meeting at 3:30 today to determine a root cause. We want you there at the table. Wow. Okay. There's really nothing else I could say after that. Is really understanding what action are you going to take to help me understand better was very, very helpful. I agree with Jeff in terms of if you can say up front so that people aren't waiting for the punchline, you know, they're not waiting, don't bury the lead. If you're going to be able to provide some sort of service recovery, some sort of payment to cover expenses, some sort, you know, there's a myriad of things depending on what the error might have been. But if you're going to do that, state that up front so that, again, that's not something they're thinking of during the conversation.
I think one of the most important things that we
I
can
think,
do. Oh, go ahead, Naomi. I'm sorry to interrupt.
oh, you didn't, well, okay. I just was gonna say, I think it's actually really important to consider what came before the error even occurred, that there's a lack of trust and a feeling that the medical profession or hospitals or the whole institution, there's some sense of that, of an adversarial relationship beforehand for many people. I mean, thinking even of people of color, Black, African Americans, who come with a whole history of that already. So if an error occurs, it's on top of there already not being any kind of trust. And I just think that's an important context and framework to take into account that has to do with how you overcome already adversarial. And I will just say that having been through error now, you know, I'm also not trusting. I mean, I'm not trusting of the medical profession. So I bring my past trauma with me as well into anything else that happens. So just, I'm more responding to context than I am, you know, how you actually overcome it.
This has been amazing. We're so lucky to have Naomi and Jeff and Brandolin, as well as Rex and Steve Lovell I saw was on earlier. And we have an amazing contingent of patient and family advocates. You know, we made the point in a recent editorial that the way to turn CRP principle into practice is to engage much, much more deeply and meaningfully with injured patients and families. And understanding how to do that is hard, but we've got an amazing resource right here that we can ask for help. So I hope this is just the first of many conversations where the patients and families who have been through really unimaginable error and harm in healthcare can sort of guide us in turning the CRP into something that's real. So let me pass things over to Nicole. I think we're at the top of the hour, and let's wrap things up.
Yes, we are right at the top of the hour. I just want to give a special thanks to our speakers for joining us today and sharing such wonderful advice and opening yourselves up to the community.